Okay, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Kelly Weiss, the Executive Director of Marketing and Communications, and thank you all for being here to discuss this very important topic that we'll be addressing today. Just going to give a few housekeeping items before we get started. So everyone will be on mute throughout the presentation, and we are going to have a pretty large audience today. So we're asking if you can keep your video off throughout. That will help us not break Zoom. So thank you for doing that. And we will have questions and answers towards the end of presentations from our panelists. How we will be doing questions, you will submit them through chat, send them to me, and then I can ask our panelists the questions. So I'd now like to introduce our Senior Associate Dean, Afra Afsharipour.
Thank you for joining our program today entitled Insurrection and the Rule of Law. I'm Afra Afsharipour, Professor of Law and Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at UC Davis School of Law. As Dean Johnson noted in his community message last week, our nation saw an unprecedented and appalling assault on the rule of law and our deep and enduring democratic traditions when a mob stormed our Capitol. With me today are three of my colleagues, each a scholar of great renown, who will help us provide both legal and historical perspective on these events and offer insights into the long-term implications of this tumultuous time for our country. Reserve time for them and for Q&A, I will keep introductions short. Professor Karima Benoon is the Homer G. Angelo and Anne Berry Hell Endowed Chair and Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law. She's an internationally renowned expert in human rights law and international law. Since 2015, Professor Benoon has served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. For today's event, she's speaking in her personal capacity and not in her United Nations capacity. Professor Ash Bhagwat is the Butcherver and Bird Endowed Chair and Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law. He's a leading constitutional law expert and internationally recognized for his expertise on a variety of subjects, including the structure of constitutional rights and free speech law. Professor Carlton Larson is the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law. A distinguished scholar of constitutional law, Professor Larson is one of the nation's leading authorities on the law of treason. And with that, I turn it over to Professor Larson.
Okay, thank you, Dean Afsharipour, and thank you to the staff of the UC Davis Law School who helped put this event together, and for all of you who are joining us on the Zoom today. The events of last week were truly horrific, something that none of us ever imagined we would see in our lifetime. And what I'll be talking about this afternoon is the criminal law aspects of this, and to what extent the activities that we saw could fit into various types of criminal offenses. And then that will lead into issues about impeachment and the 14th Amendment with my colleague, Professor Bhagwat. So when one saw what was happening at the Capitol last week, it was clearly we were witnessing rampant criminal activity in progress. And it's easy to just imagine very low-level offenses that were committed, such as trespass or vandalism, firearms offenses, even perhaps offenses against mask ordinances and public gatherings. There certainly will be assault charges as a result of this. There may well be murder charges as a result of the death of the police officer, possibly the felony murder doctrine, which allows people who didn't actually do the killing, but who were part of it, to be charged with murder as well. And then potentially the very, very serious charges of seditious conspiracy and conceivably even treason. So there's been a lot of talk about sedition in the news lately. In fact, while the events at the Capitol were unfolding, I was actually recording a podcast on the subject of sedition that had been scheduled a few days before. They wanted to talk about whether members of Congress objecting to the certification were guilty of sedition. And so it's funny, I was actually talking about sedition while all of this was going on. And as a general matter, there is no broad crime of sedition. We have had various sedition statutes over the course of our history. But what we do have on the books is an offense called seditious conspiracy. And the seditious conspiracy statute says if two or more persons conspire to overthrow, put down, or to destroy by force the government of the United States, or by force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States, or by force to seize, take, or possess any property of the United States, they shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 20 years, or both. And that does seem to be a pretty clear fit for with what many of these insurrectionists did. That is, that they sought to oppose by force the operation of a law of the United States, the Electoral Count Act, and they were possessing property of the United States in the form of the United States Capitol. And it's my understanding that the United States Attorney's Office in DC is seriously considering a charge of seditious conspiracy for at least some of the people who are involved in the assault on the Capitol. Now, what we haven't heard a whole lot about in the news is the crime of treason. And as a treason scholar, this is something that actually surprises me a bit, because we have talked a lot about treason over the last 4 years, and my role has primarily been to tell the media and anybody else who would listen that the described events are not, in fact, treason because of technicalities in our treason law. But this event actually does come very close to and may well constitute the crime of treason. So in September, I published this book on treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law, which is an attempt to explain the law of treason in layman's terms for people who are not lawyers. And so what I'll be talking about here draws from this book. So Article 3 of the Constitution limits treason to 2 offenses: levying war against the United States and adhering to our enemies, giving them aid and comfort. And almost all of the 20th century cases have been cases of adhering to enemies. And so we haven't talked much about levying war against the United States. The last prosecutions were really in the 19th century. So what does it mean to levy war against the United States? Well, if we look at some of the older cases coming out of the late 18th century, such as the Whiskey Rebellion, we are told by Justice Patterson of the United States Supreme Court that an attempt to prevent the execution of an act of Congress by force and intimidation is high treason by levying war against the United States. In 1842, Justice Joseph Story, in his very famous treatise on constitutional law, says it is treason by force to prevent the execution of one or more general and public laws of the government, or to resist the exercise of any legitimate authority of the government in its sovereign capacity. And so if we take those early views of the law, it's quite clear that the people who stormed the Capitol by force to stop Congress from doing its business had committed treason by levying war against the United States. So I published a piece that came out last Friday in the Washington Post arguing that the framers would have understood that this conduct amounted to treason. Now, it gets a little complicated because there's later case law that suggests that you have to actually attempt to overthrow the entire government, not just suppress the execution of one particular law. And so in 1851, Justice Robert Greer held that levying war should be limited to insurrections and rebellions for the purpose of overthrowing the government by force and arms. So that raises the interesting question of whether or not what we saw last week was an attempt to overthrow the entire government, or simply to stop the operation of one particular law. Now, you might note that this is not just any law. This isn't, the excise tax on whiskey, which was an issue in the Whiskey Rebellion, but this is the Electoral Count Act, and this is the certification of the next president of the United States. And obstructing that in an attempt to try to keep the current president in power seems very, very close to overthrowing the government of the United States, and may well constitute an attempt to overthrow the government of the United States. But that's the issue on which this would turn if it actually reached court. Now, my guess is a prosecutor would not bring a treason charge just because there are legal complications here. There's also the question of you have to have two witnesses to the same overt act, which is required in Article 3. So we probably won't see it. And there's also an interesting question of whether President Trump could also be liable for treason. Here, the general view is that all the people involved in levying war, even if they played a minute part, are equally guilty. Historically, the law had said in treason there are no accessories, all are principals. And so if he was involved to some extent in this action, he potentially could be subject to a treason charge as well. That said, I do not expect to see that. Now, there's another criminal law issue lurking here, and that's the issue of incitement. And this relates specifically to President Trump and to the other speakers at the rally. And the issue is, did he violate the criminal law by inciting this mob to go to the Capitol? Well, under our First Amendment doctrine, as articulated in the very famous case of Brandenburg versus Ohio in the late 1960s, you can be punished for speech inciting unlawful conduct only if the speech was directed to inciting imminent unlawful conduct and was likely to incite such conduct. And the standard example we give as law professors for that is inciting a crowd to a riot. But that's sort of your standard example in Brandenburg. So many of the elements of Brandenburg here would have been met. You had imminence, you had a crowd that was right there ready to march to the Capitol. You had the likelihood that this would happen given all the circumstances and the president making the speech. The tricky part is whether Trump truly was making a speech directed to inciting imminent unlawful conduct. And the problem there is, if he had said squarely, storm the Capitol, go break into the Capitol, that would be an incitement. But he didn't quite say that. He said things that were close to that. And so the problem then is figuring out whether that actually counts as incitement. And that would also be, I think, a question of law for a court. And it's possible the court might say that there is a First Amendment defense in this situation. Now, it's important to note that the First Amendment is not a defense to impeachment proceedings. So even though the House has impeached or will impeach shortly the president for incitement, they're not using incitement in the standard sense. They're using incitement in a broader sense. I mean, they're not using it as a legal matter, because if we start arguing about Brandenburg, then it just becomes really quite intricate and messy. Really, I think the House probably should have used the phrase, fomenting a riot or encouraging a riot, rather than this legal term of incitement. So that's all I have for now. Happy to turn it over to my colleagues, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Larson. We now turn it to Professor Bhagwat.
I'm going to speak about not the criminal consequences that Professor Larson just covered, but possible political responses to the events of last week. Obviously, there's, for understandable reasons, a great deal of unhappiness with President Trump's behavior. Whether or not it arose to the level of a crime is something that is frankly debatable. But regardless, it's clear that at least the Democrats and some Republicans in the House, including Liz Cheney and others, wish to respond. So what can they do? I'm going to start with impeachment, because the House is currently, as we know, debating an article of impeachment, which is likely to be adopted soon after we finish speaking. It seems clear to me that there's no legal barrier to impeaching President Trump for his behavior. Whether or not it technically qualified as sedition or as incitement, and there are reasons to doubt that. I actually do not fully share Professor Larson's view. I think there's a reason why actually his speech might have been unprotected, because he was speaking in his capacity as president, and that's not protected speech. But regardless, it's clear that conduct does not have to arise to be a crime in order to be something that is subject to impeachment under the High Crimes and Misdemeanors Clause of the Constitution, because what is impeachable, an impeachable offense, is a political judgment, not a legal one. It's one for the House to make at first, and then the Senate to decide finally on trial. Impeachment is almost certainly going to happen, given both Democratic and some Republican support. As of now, it looks like the trial is not going to commence until at earliest the 19th of January. And since President Trump will leave office at noon on the 20th, nothing can possibly be concluded before he's out of office. Which doesn't mean impeachment should not proceed, because in addition to removal from office, another possible consequence of impeachment is preventing any further, preventing the person convicted of holding any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States in the future. So I think that process will proceed, but it's not going to be an urgent one, because the consequences are really for the 2024 election, not anything immediate. The other two provisions, so that's on the table, it's happening, but like, as I said, I don't think it's going to have any immediate consequences. The other two provisions that have been batted around in the last 2 weeks are more relevant, though also tricky. The most significant one is the 25th Amendment, which authorizes the Vice President of the United States, with the vote of over half of the cabinet, a majority of the cabinet, to declare that the president is unable to perform his duties and therefore take over as acting president. I want you to note that this does not mean that he will be removed from office. Technically, it would rather mean his office would be suspended and Vice President Trump would act as president as long as President Trump was unable to perform his duties. Vice President Pence has said he's not willing to invoke the 25th Amendment in a letter that he sent to Speaker Pelosi yesterday. And the reason he gave, and I want to make sure I emphasize, it's not an unreasonable position he's taking. He's saying that the 25th Amendment was designed for medical disability, for someone who is physically unable to perform the duties of the president. And of course, President Trump does not have a medical disability. He's not undergoing surgery. He hasn't had a stroke, kinds of things that in the past have been relevant factors. Whether or not his behavior in the last week demonstrates that he is essentially psychologically unable to perform the duties of the president strike me as being a closer question. But I actually have some sympathy with Vice President Pence's hesitation to go that route, because it's such an ineffable thing. And really the 25th Amendment, we don't want to create precedents for essentially using the 25th Amendment left and right to remove presidents or suspend presidents. On the other hand, I think that President Trump's actions recently, especially his most recent refusal to take any responsibility for the events of last week, in which he describes basically his speech to the crowd as being completely unproblematic, might cross a line. And I think that it's a judgment call whether or not the 25th Amendment should be invoked under these circumstances. I think I disagree with Vice President Pence's decision, but I'm not going to claim that it's a crazier and unreasonable one. The final provision, one that frankly no one had thought about in about 150 years, but has suddenly been raised, is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was adopted immediately after the Civil War and is perhaps the most significant amendment in American history, but Section 3, frankly, has been dormant. And the reason is what Section 3 says is that no one who has previously sworn an oath to support the Constitution and have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution or given aid or comfort to the enemies of the Constitution shall hold any public office under the United States. So essentially, anyone who is engaged in insurrection is prohibited from holding office in the future if they have previously held public office and sworn an oath to support the Constitution. Obviously, President Trump swore an oath to support the Constitution. The question is, first of all, Congress would need to implement Section 3 via a statute, which I'm not aware that it's ever done. So it would have to pass a law saying that anyone who engaged in such and such acts was no longer eligible for any office under the United States. But there's also the question of whether or not President Trump engaged in insurrection or rebellion or gave aid or comfort to the enemies of the United States, i.e. the mob that stormed the Capitol. And again, this is a question that really has not arisen since the Civil War. And during the Civil War, it was obvious. If you served in the Confederacy, of course you were engaged in insurrection. Today, it's a close question because he didn't storm the Capitol. I have no doubt that if anyone who did storm the Capitol and had or holds public office in the United States, they are disqualified from federal office under Section 3. But whether or not President Trump's own actions rise to that level is again debatable, even if Congress passes a statute moving forward. All of which is to say, I'm going to keep this brief because I'm sure there'll be questions, but I'm going to focus on what people are especially interested in, is that there does not appear to be any viable way between now and a week from today to remove President Trump from office. Having given 25th Amendment was the most viable path forward, Vice President Pence has made the judgment that I disagree with, but I would not deny is reasonable, to not invoke the 25th Amendment. And so the responses are going to be long-term. And I think that probably the most sensible thing to do is to hold an impeachment trial at some point in the Senate. It needn't be soon because there's no urgency at this point. And I think certainly his actions do entitle the Senate to both convict him and to prohibit him from holding office in the future. But I think that's the most that is possible that we're going to see. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Bhagwat. I now turn it to Professor Karima Banoun.
Thank you very much. In light of my areas of specialty, I am going to sort of switch our area of focus, and I'm going to address the global dimensions of the attack on the US Capitol and how it may affect the rule of law around the world. And then I'm going to survey some of what we can learn from other experiences with extremism and the threats that extremism poses to human rights. So turning first to the global consequences, there are really multiple layers of impacts that we can think about on DC as a city, on the Capitol, on the nation, but we cannot forget the international implications. The whole world is watching is not just a slogan, but a reality in our globalized era. And around the world, many governments, international organizations, and UN officials reacted very swiftly to the Capitol attack. For example, on January 6th, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres tweeted that he was saddened and that, quote, in such circumstances, it is important that political leaders impress on their followers the need to refrain from violence, as well as to respect democratic processes and the rule of law. The next day, on January 7th, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, also issued a statement indicating that she was deeply troubled by Wednesday's attack, which for her clearly demonstrated the destructive impact of sustained, deliberate distortion of facts and incitement to violence and hatred by political leaders. She supported calls for a thorough investigation into these events, and she called on leaders across the political spectrum, including the president specifically, to disavow what she called false and dangerous narratives. At the regional level, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issued a statement quite quickly, repudiating the violence perpetrated against the Capitol and against, as it said, democratic institutions and procedures in the United States. And it noted that inter-American instruments calling for the right to freedom of assembly hold that that right must be exercised peacefully and without weapons. Opponents of the United States also weighed in with their own interpretations around the world. For example, China's state-owned Global Times claimed parallels between the insurrection at the Capitol and Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests. And this really exemplifies, I think, the grim reality that in addition to the threats to democracy they pose here, these events will now be used by many repressive governments as a tool to undermine human rights and democratic claims elsewhere. As Madiha Afzal noted for Brookings, the images of insurrectionists occupying America's legislative seat of power will be part of the Chinese official media's playback for a long time to come. And there were similar statements from Iranian and Russian officials, amongst others. Non-state actors are also instrumentalizing the events, with the so-called Islamic State in its weekly publication signaling that it intends to exploit the domestic unrest here. In light of all of this global reaction, Foreign Policy magazine speaks of nothing less than what it calls indelible damage to US foreign policy. And I think there can be no question but that the United States has been internationally weakened, both by the Trump presidency as a whole and by the Capitol attack, and specifically weakened in ways that benefit the enemies of the rule of law and human rights everywhere. This is going to have many ramifications, including domestically on the economy, but it also will greatly complicate any efforts by the Biden administration to champion human rights and the rule of law in the UN system and around the world, something which is gravely needed in today's fraught world. What does this mean also for sort of promotion of democracy? I was really struck by the statement by Natalie Brown last week, the African-American US ambassador to Uganda. Now, Uganda is a country facing potentially violent elections tomorrow that the United States was supposed to be observing. It has now canceled that due to its concerns about the electoral process there. But nonetheless, it was a very difficult moment for the ambassador to try to find a creative way to reestablish US credibility to speak on these concerns at all. And she wrote in a January 8th statement, "When we speak out against human rights abuses, we do not do so because such abuses do not occur in America. On the contrary, we do so because we are mindful of the work still to be done in the American experiment with democracy, and because our history has taught us that democracy must be defended if it is to endure." And I think this kind of transparent and humble perspective, which likewise does not shrink from standing for human rights internationally, will be essential going forward. This brings me to the second set of issues that I'd like to address. And I also wrote a relevant book, which is called Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, which was about, in that case, Muslims around the world standing up to Muslim fundamentalist extremism. And I learned a great deal from that experience. And I wanted to talk a bit about those lessons and how we can sort of extrapolate some of them and apply them to the situation that we are now facing here. What is very clear is that if we do not have a systematic approach to tackle the extremism which gave rise to last week's events, and which, let's be clear, threatens more violence across this country in the coming days, we will face a protracted assault on the rule of law and on many human rights in this country. And I think there's nothing more dangerous than the normalization of extremist ideology and rhetoric. I learned that in my research, and that has been a core aspect of President Trump's presidency, and I think it will be one of his most lasting legacies and one that needs to be tackled with vigor. We also have to understand that the rise of extremism is part of a global phenomenon. There are diverse forms of far-right extremism around the world, today posing major threats to human rights, whether when movements that espouse them are in power, such as in Brazil or Turkey or India, or when they are non-state movements, as in so many places. And in fact, extremism in the United States buoys extremism elsewhere. Let's pause for a moment and think of the international implications of the symbol of slavery and systematic racial discrimination being displayed inside the US Capitol to the world, or the messages glorifying the Holocaust worn by those who violently interrupted congressional proceedings. Think of what those lasting images mean in a world battling diverse extremists who reject equality and sow hatred. Now, extremist ideologies and the movements that espouse them also have to be understood in human rights terms. I think they're often addressed in security terms. And I think there has to be a human rights response that involves full implementation of human rights norms, but also recognizes those norms as a limitation on how we can actually combat extremism. Governments have to ensure there is a counterweight to extremist discourse. They have to publicly challenge that discourse, and they have to really also work in the education system to make sure that there is education complying with human rights norms, that is strengthening respect for rights and promoting critical thinking. And I really recommend the UNESCO Teacher's Guide on the Prevention of Violent Extremism, something that we might not have until recently thought was especially relevant in the United States, but so clearly is now. I learned many other things from working on extremism in other contexts. I want to not speak for too long, so I will just share a few. One is that I think it's always important to remember that it is not just the violence of extremists that is the problem. We've heard that view expressed in recent days. It is also the underlying ideology that motivates the violence. So in this case, various forms of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, Christian nationalism, the underlying ideology, is to dislodge and discredit the ideology and to disempower the organizations which promote it. And of course, this has to be done effectively, but also in a rights-respecting way. I also think one thing that we need to remember is that the struggle against extremism that we need is multifaceted. It has to include political, legal, cultural, educational, media, and economic components, as well as an effective and rights-respecting security response. But I think what we always have to remember is, as important as the security response may be, especially now, say between now and the 20th of January, it is really the tip of the iceberg. We need the sort of comprehensive, holistic response. Now, a democratic society, by definition, recognizes differing viewpoints and the rights to freedom of association and expression. But these are also concepts that extremists sometimes seek to exploit while denying these very rights to others. And I think it's important to always remember one of the messages of international human rights law, which is that things like the right to political belief or political participation, or the right to assembly, or the right to freedom of expression may not be lawfully employed to undermine the internationally guaranteed rights of others. This is clear from the language of human rights law itself. And I think it is incredibly important to remember that there are limits within these rights that have to do with protecting the rights of others. Now, these events have been shocking, and yet they shouldn't be in a way because they are the logical conclusion of the extremist ideology that the president has exploited and espoused since prior to his election. And I think they should be a wake-up call to us that our response, the response of our society as a whole to extremism, has been insufficient, and that the rule of law and human rights require ongoing vigilant defense, including in democracies. We face really an avalanche of hate to which we have to have an urgent riposte. We really have to build and rebuild the culture of human rights through effective, thoughtful, international law abiding action. And I think what we need to always remember is that we can stop extremism, but doing so requires extraordinary commitment, courage, and thoughtfulness. And I would say really to conclude quickly, despite this bleak picture, it is not a moment for despair, but really a moment for hope based on concrete action. And I return here to the powerful words of Ambassador Natalie Brown. She wrote last week, while the criminal actions of those who stormed the Capitol captured the world's attention, I choose to celebrate the unsung heroes who once again made it possible for the United States to conduct elections and embark on the transfer of power that represents the will of the people. She listed many such heroes, including the court workers and judges, as she said, appointed by Republican and Democratic administrations alike, who ensured the public's right to contest election laws and to evaluate allegations of fraud, and who rendered their decisions in accordance with the law, not with political affiliation. And I would add to her list of heroes, Capitol Police Officer Eugene Goodman, who risked his life to lure extremists away from Senate chambers. It is now up to all of us to show as much courage and determination in defense of the rule of law as all of these heroes did. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Benoon, Professor Bhagwat, and Professor Larson. Please make sure that you place your questions in the chat directly to Kelly Weiss, and I will turn it over to Kelly to ask one of the first questions that has been posed.
Okay, thanks, Afra. We have a question from Timothy who says, what is needed to prevent Trump from holding office in the future?
I can take a shot at that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's pretty clear to me that if he is impeached by 2/3 of the Senate, then by a simple majority vote, the Senate can add as one of the consequences of impeachment a bar on future holding of office. That's the most obvious path forward. And that's frankly one of the purposes of impeachment. So it's the path that makes the most sense. In theory, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment also provides a path forward because of the theory that if you engage in insurrection, you cannot hold office, and that Congress could implement by simple legislation because Section 5 authorizes them to implement the 14th Amendment. But I think that's a much more tricky path because demonstrating that the president engaged in insurrection would be, it's not certainly the case I would want to be litigating. So impeachment is the obvious path forward on that issue.
Okay. Any other thoughts from our panel on that one? No? Okay. We have another question from Sue who says, if we invoke the 25th Amendment for Trump being psychologically unfit to hold office, how will that affect criminal and civil cases against him if there are any?
Not at all. It has no consequence. The only purpose of the 25th Amendment is to stop the president from acting because he's unable to do so and temporarily making the vice president the acting president. It has no going forward consequences, either negative or positive for the president.
Okay, it's a pretty simple, straightforward answer there. We've had a few questions coming in about social media and Trump's ability to use social media. James writes, what are your thoughts on social media platforms suspending Trump? Was this a necessary protection or a slippery slope? Professor Bhagwat?
I hate to be dominating this because I want to hear what my colleagues have to say, but in my most recent book, Our Democratic First Amendment, which was published in June, I speak a lot about this, about the role of social media in American politics. Part of the book is a history of the First Amendment, but a lot of it is on this topic. It's tricky. Clearly, they have a legal right to suspend President Trump's accounts because they're not bound by the First Amendment, they're private actors. On the other hand, one should be concerned at giving a handful of platforms and tech companies, because it really is a handful of people, most of whom are in the Bay Area or in Seattle, that kind of power over American politics. Having said that, I very, very firmly do believe, and I disagree with Facebook on this, that the policies that apply to private individuals should also apply to politicians. A First Amendment in any free speech theory in which politicians have greater speech rights than citizens strikes me as being nutty. And since, in my view, President Trump clearly violated the terms of service for all of these platforms, and if you or I had done what he had done, we would have been shut down years ago, I think their action was appropriate.
Okay. We have a question here from Sinead who says, what do you say to those in the House today, making the case that a vote to impeach is a vote to divide the country? In my view, it is a vote to restore a sliver of faith back into the democratic process the US purports to rely on.
I'd like to comment on this one from a nonpartisan perspective. And I think unity is very important, but I think unity can only be achieved after accountability. And to me, what this process is really about is accountability. And I have to say that I really admire the Republicans who are willing to actually sort of transcend partisan affiliation and speak out for accountability. I think that that is incredibly important in the world of human rights and the world of politics, to be willing to break with and criticize your own side. I think we have to absolutely reject extremist ideas, but I think we also have to be willing to continue dialogue with people who have different views where that is possible. So I think unity is important, but we have to be very clear about what the red lines are on that. And you cannot simply sort of declare what happened last week as over. You have to deal with the consequences before you can bring the population together.
Okay. Professor Larson, any?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I mean, it's quite crazy to say that the people dividing the nation are the Democrats who are simply pointing out the consequences of a president who refused to concede an election and who lied over and over and over again to the American people, and then fomented a mob to physically attack a coordinate branch of government. And for Democrats to then point out, yes, there are consequences for that behavior, including impeachment, and then to say that, well, the Democrats are the ones being divisive is absolutely ludicrous. It is President Trump who is most responsible for any divisions right now in this nation.
I want to go beyond that from Dean Afsharapur. She asks, what implications might there be for members of Congress involved in the rally last week? Can others involved in the rally also be held accountable? Professor Larson?
Well, I mean, Congress has the power to expel members by a 2/3 vote. So it's possible that members might be expelled. We're hearing news reports that some members may have taken some of these insurrectionists on a tour of the Capitol the day before the event, pointing to where different corridors were. I think that makes a very strong case for expulsion of a member of Congress. But it's also true that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment that Professor Bhagwat referred to would also apply to members of Congress. And so if they were engaged in insurrection, they presumably also would be barred from public office as well. I think it's a little tricky figuring out exactly how we implement Section 3, because it does appear on its face to sort of be absolute. And it was actually Chief Justice Chase had two conflicting rulings on this in the 1860s. He held in one case that it's not self-executing, that requires legislation by Congress, but in another case, the case of Jefferson Davis, he actually said that of its own force, it precluded Davis's prosecution for treason, that this was meant to be the sole punishment for the Confederates. And so that was never really resolved, and we haven't had clear legislation on this point. I agree with Professor Bhagwat that legislation would be desirable, although it's an interesting question whether of its own force it might deprive someone of office.
Okay. A question came in from Destiny, who says, can you ask someone to touch on how the events of last Thursday weakened foreign trade policy between other countries?
I wonder if Dean Afsharipur is the person to address that.
Well, I'll say just one issue, which I think there is a lot of uncertainty actually after the Trump administration with respect to our trade relations with a number of other jurisdictions. As I think we mentioned, I'm in the discussion that we had before all of this, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was disinvited from a number of meetings that we had. But one of the other things that I think is really important, and you've seen in the corporate response to the events of last week, is the importance of the rule of law and political stability for businesses to be able to function effectively. And both our corporations as well as our capital markets are dependent on the rule of law to be able to function effectively. And so I think that's one of the reasons why you are seeing the kind of pretty vast response from the corporate sector pushing against some of the members of Congress who have been involved in trying to undermine the election results.
Any other thoughts from the panel? Good there. Okay. Stephanie says, do those who storm the Capitol have a defense that they truly believe the election was stolen and that they were upholding democracy, as ludicrous as that may be? What about the legislators who make the claim then supported the objections to the electors from Pennsylvania and some others?
You know what
Well,
I'd like to
sorry.
Go ahead.
You go ahead, Kumi.
Thank you. I just want to say quickly, I think it is really important that it is not just those who stormed in from outside who are held responsible, though I believe it's critically important that they're held responsible. But we're hearing some of this discourse today in Congress that really, this came from outside. These were, somehow isolated actors. And there was a fascinating statement made by one of the rioters as he was pushing into the Capitol that was caught on the special that Wolf Blitzer did on Sunday, where he said, he was sort of screaming, we used to be law-abiding people, but it's the government that has made us this way. And of course, he meant that as, it's the election being stolen from us. But I thought there was actually a different truth to it, which is that it is the propaganda, it is the false information and the false narratives that the High Commissioner for Human Rights condemned, coming from both, the president, but also from other elected officials that I think have really influenced people. And, this is where I wanted to make the connection between the ideology and the violence. It is both the proponents of the hateful messages and those who acted on them who have to be held responsible here.
Yeah, and I would add that just having false beliefs is no defense to a criminal prosecution. I mean, if that were the case, all kinds of criminals would have defenses. Someone who honestly believes that private property is unconstitutional, they could then storm my house. No, that's just not the way it works. You are still responsible for your criminal activity, even if you thought you had a justified reason for doing it. This case, they just really need to make it really quite clear that there was absolutely no justification for this, and that the arguments for going into the Capitol were really about as frivolous as saying, well, we should go into the Capitol because there's a handful of space aliens from Mars roaming around the rotunda. I mean, it's just completely ludicrous. Some of these people may have honestly believed those things, but that doesn't make them any less criminal.
I want to add something too, I agreed with everything that both of my colleagues said, but I think it's very important to bear in mind a distinction between doing things that are unethical and doing things that are illegal. With respect to the members of Congress who contested the election, Senators Hawley and Cruz and a very large number of Republicans in the House, I find their behavior detestable. I absolutely feel that they should be held politically accountable for the refusal to accept the results of the election, but they had a right to vote to contest the election. It was they did it as pursuant to congressional procedures, and that cannot be in itself any sort of a criminal act. I think the responsibility here lies not to sort of respond to that, lies not with the legal system, but with the political system.
Can I just say, I think that you've made such an important point, and what we have to remember here is that there are multiple forms of accountability, political, cultural, legal, and we have to think about all of them where they are relevant. But it's the impunity for this kind of lawlessness, it's the impunity for this kind of violence that seeks to really subvert the constitutional order that is such a big problem. And it's a big problem for our rule of law at home domestically, but it is also a huge problem in terms of the message that it sends internationally to people who would engage in similar conduct elsewhere without being held accountable in a variety of ways or in any way at all.
Let me add one last point about that. If in fact evidence does emerge that members of Congress worked in advance with the crowd that stormed the Capitol and allowed it and sort of encouraged and allowed it to happen, I think then, of course, they're criminally liable, probably under the sedition conspiracy statute that Professor Larson was talking about. Mm-hmm. I'm simply talking about their behavior on the floor of the Congress, and that, to my mind, is something that only can be held politically accountable.
Okay, continuing this discussion about what information is being put out there, Casper says, what liability do the news networks face for perpetuating false stories that led to the insurrection? Are there any consequences?
I'm not, the news story, I guess we would, maybe Fox News. I don't know that there are any consequences there. We don't punish the media in this country for saying things that aren't true. It's, I think that would be, unless something rises to the level of some sort of personal libel, I think there's no legal accountability. Again, political accountability is a different matter. Mm-hmm. Does anyone disagree with me?
No.
I wouldn't disagree. I think it's a question of whether we use the word liability or responsibility. And I think when we look at the responsibility of the media in the way that they have participated in the last 4 years, We can look at a range of sort of kinds of responsibility, whether it was all the coverage that was given to the Trump rallies in the first place at the very beginning of the presidential election campaign in 2016. And this is across the ideological spectrum because it was good TV, right? And so it was given much more attention than other candidates were. And, you know, I think there's certainly not liability for that, but there's responsibility and sort of ethical questions. And then I think we really need to ask questions in terms of political responsibility and ethical responsibility around carrying false messages over and over again that the election was rigged. So I certainly agree with you. You know, it's not a question here, you know, under these facts of legal liability, but I do think we have to consider media responsibility and have that discussion going forward.
There's a question here or a comment for Professor Benoon that says there's a point about disempowering extremist groups that seems likely to generate claims of the cancel culture. Is there some role here for restorative justice to broker a conversation with the 74 million people in the country who believe they are marginalized?
You know, I think that that's a really great question. And I think one of the things I didn't get to in my remarks for reasons of time, I want to make the point that, you know, rejection of extremist ideology in very strong terms is important because very often what I've seen working on other forms of extremism is that accommodation is interpreted as a signal to move forward, actually not as a signal to compromise. And yet at the same time, it is critically important, A, not to demonize entire demographic groups of people, such as people from rural America or people from the Midwest. I mean, I think about this a lot because I am of Midwestern and Arab Muslim heritage, and I see a lot of demonization now of Midwestern people in a way that people sort of did wrongly after 9/11 or in the face of jihadist terrorism. And this is also wrong. This is very unhelpful, and it really alienates whole groups of people. I think what we need to do in political terms is really help the sort of the center, the right, and a big mass of kind of independent or apolitical, some of whom feel disenfranchised people in the United States, and really help them sort of boost their immunity to extremist rhetoric by finding ways actually of making them feel included, not excluded. And I actually think the trick is you have to do both of these things at the same time, which is the clear rejection of the extremist ideas, and yet, you know, finding ways to keep dialogue going, even when it is sometimes very, very difficult to do that. So I welcome that question. I think that that's one we really have to think about very carefully.
Okay. Well, we've had a lot of questions coming in. I haven't been able to get to all of them, but I think we have time for one more here that each of our panelists can comment on. And that is from Emily, who says, what will our panelists be watching for in the coming days, as there are credible rumors of additional unrest and violence brewing in advance of the inauguration?
I can start. I mean, there's clearly credible evidence because law enforcement is worried. Members of Congress are worried. The National Guard has been called out. I mean, there's been maybe the fact that Parler has effectively been shut down might slow this down a little bit, but certainly there are groups in this country who are planning violence. How serious they are, it's very hard to say. Whether or not in the face of an armed National Guard presence, they would actually dare to do anything, it's very hard to say. But the concerns are very, very real. I mean, because you don't call out the National Guard for no good reason. It's not a good visual, right? To have a lot of armed soldiers present at the president's inauguration. But so clearly people who are in control feel that there's a need for it. It's also striking that the Joint Chiefs of Staff felt necessary yesterday to publish a letter to all service members emphasizing their support of Joe Biden's inauguration. Understand me, I had no doubt that that's where the Joint Chiefs would end up. I have faith in our military. But the fact that they felt the need to publish that letter, that's unheard of in American history. So yes, there are absolutely reasons for concern.
Great.
I think politicians really have to think very carefully about the rhetoric that they are using in this current situation. I am very concerned about these reports of the possibility of some kind of armed activity at all 50 state capitals in this country between now and the inauguration. I think that has to be taken very seriously. I think we have to see a very sophisticated and well-organized law enforcement presence and preparation for that. But I am really concerned at some of the messages, even listening to some of the speeches today in the impeachment debate, that are very inflammatory and do not seem to me to have learned some of the lessons that we should have learned last week. So there's both the security aspect, but I think the political aspect of really trying to tone down the rhetoric is as important. And I'll also say this, I lived through the experience of one side of my family going through a civil war, which is a really horrible experience and something that all countries should do everything that they can to avoid. And my father faced a great deal of security threats, but I also remember what he said, which is you have to be very careful. You have to take your security very seriously, but you also have to avoid doing the work of terrorists for them, which is not to give in to fear, even while being very careful at the same time and very vigilant. And to me, that's a very important message. At the end of the day, we saw a free and fair election. We are going to see a transfer of power, a constitutional transfer of power. The system worked in that sense. And I think we need to focus on that positive aspect as well going forward.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything my co-panelists said. There's a lot of uncertainty what happens in the next week. But there's one thing that I think is crystal clear, and that is that Donald Trump's term ends at noon on January 20th by operation of the 20th Amendment, and he will be gone from office. No matter what else happens, that is going to happen.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank our marketing department, particularly Kelly Weiss and Jose Perez and Onel Barrios for all of their work in organizing this event at a very last minute set of organizations. And I'd like to really, really commend and thank my colleagues, Professor Larson, Professor Bhagwat, and Professor Banoon for their insightful comments today and for educating all of us. I appreciate all of you for taking the time for being here. Thank you.